I think we should start. First of all, I would like to welcome you all very much to the AA. My name is Mark Cousins, and I'm the Director of General Studies, and I'm going to kind of chair the event this evening. Before we start, may I say, in case anyone needed it, that we have been trying very hard since before Christmas to be able to kind of offer signage, and simply were unable to kind of have it provided. So I do apologize. Now, the reason for this event is rather sort of, I think, unusual in the terms of what normally happens here in the evening at the AA, a lecture, whatever. This is not really an event to lecture you. It's an event, really, it's in a sense a call for a meeting to ask for your help, help on the basis of your own kind of individual expertise. In respect to the following matter. The AA is currently kind of a mind to set up a new MA course, which provisionally we're entitling kind of inclusive design. Now, obviously that course, which is to be organized and led by Andrew Walker, is a kind of successor to the environmental access course, which was with him and the AA the first course, I think, in the field in 1993. But kind of time has passed since then, and to some extent some of the issues and the ways of looking at them have changed. Perhaps it's signalled by the very term inclusive design. But when we were sitting there thinking about it last term, it seemed kind of odd to be proposing a course in inclusive design which didn't, as it were, offer a kind of inclusiveness in the process of planning the degree. Rather than kind of sit here with a few of us kind of thinking up what a course should be, we felt that we should make the planning of the course part of a deliberate process which involves as many people who wish to volunteer their voice and their assistance, whatever, and to make the planning of the degree course as open as possible. For that reason, we're also asking, I think there is a sheet of paper which we're going to pass round, and we hope everyone will kind of sign their name and address or how they can be reached, so that we can sort of inform you of the progress of the planning, and also, perhaps have other meetings to kind of hammer out particular issues. In that sense, this evening, we'll start with a few preliminary kind of introductions to the issues, but in our mind, the primary purpose of this evening was to solicit, your views on the proposed kind of MA. As I said, since the AA established the first academic qualification in environmental access in 1993, the issue of inclusive design has gained much wider recognition. Now, the discussion this evening, I think, should consider this proposal then to establish the MA in inclusive design at the AA. This evening, we're going to hear from Andrew Walker, who was head of technical studies at the AA from 1983 to 1995, and who established the first environmental access course here. We're also going to hear from Coleman, Ferguson, Principle of Product Design for Transport for London. So I'm going to ask Andrew to say something and then the other two to add something. But as I say, it's really our mind that the burden of the evening is really to provide an opportunity for you to help to advise and guide us, protect us from kind of pitfalls, and all in all kind of move towards making this kind of reinvented degree take the whole issue forward into a kind of new generation of work and a much wider recognition. So I'm going to ask Andrew to start.
Thank you very much, Mark. And thank you very much for attending here on a bloody awful night. You better keep your coats on. Can I just mention a few apologies from people? Rachel Hurst and Keith Bright from University of Reading, Pete Kirscher from the Italian Institute of Design and Disability, Graham Findlay, Disability Wales, Valerie Wenham of the National Trust, Chris Harrowell can't attend tonight and has let us off the sign language interpreter hook, and Malcolm Johnson has been taken ill from Central School. I've also received a few emails. I'll just mention them very briefly. Laurie Ringhurt from California says he'd love to be with us, but he'd be happy to discuss the course that he teaches at master's level to architecture, landscape architecture, interior design and city planning students, and we can talk by email about that. And John Christopherson has emailed about his problems with normality and the problem and all that stuff, which we've dealt with endlessly in the EA, because we're into diversity and not normality and not special needs at all. And then Jim Muller and several other people have sent emails supporting this initiative. Can I just talk quickly about the course that, what happened on the course and how it developed, and some of the important things that I think ingredients which should continue with any course that continues at the AA to do with inclusion. The course was set up in 1992 and started in 1993 in January. It was encouraged by the then chair Anne Balfour, who put in an accessible lavatory and had the back of the AA made accessible. Now most of you won't realise that those things weren't there. He put induction loops in this room and in the communication studio and brought a lightweight temporary ramp for the front building, which still exists. I think now part of it is made of timber. The proposals the proposed course needed credibility with both disabled people and design organisations. And that is terribly important, because there's been too much done on both sides, with ignoring one or the other. And we rejected the medical model in support of the social model of disability. The course was discussed with Julie Fleck, who's here, and Jane Campbell, who's been very helpful. Now, I went to the Access Committee to get their endorsement, and they said they couldn't endorse it. So that wasn't very helpful. I went to the RIBA's Education Committee, and they agreed, well, the president was there with his stomach on the table, and then, which gave me more confidence, and then it was agreed that they would endorse not the course, but this long overdue course initiative. So you can endorse initiatives like anything. I'm using that now myself, actually, for other people's courses. There was opposition from a leading architect, AA trained, who wrote to the chair complaining he'd been doing this stuff for years for disabled people, not of disabled people, and was well qualified, and if he had been doing it, it would be done properly, and he should have been consulted. Now, that's the very reason I didn't go to the establishment, because that's part of the problem. From the start, it was to be multidisciplinary and include disabled and non-disabled people. So we had different professions and all sorts of people doing it. It covered the polemic, disability awareness training, architecture, planning, product design and transport. It looked at education buildings, housing, theatres, cinemas, stations, historic buildings, etc. It brought into the school the major organisations dealing with the issue of environmental access. Essays, theses and access audits had to be prepared. There's been so many done in this building, I can't tell you. Visits were made to test transport and facilities in different parts of the country. Organisations such as People First, the Learning Disabled Organisation, national organisation, held seminars in the school for both graduate and undergraduate students, which were some of the best things that's ever happened here, in my opinion. Alan encouraged this development, and the course became part of the mainstream undergraduate course at first, intermediate and diploma level. An exhibition was held and an opening lecture. Leading figures from the right, left and centre of politics attended. So the Bedford estate could not say no to our ramp at the front. Seminars in perceptions of space were led by people with different disabilities at buildings undergoing developments for Arts Council funded projects, such as the Royal Festival Hall, Oval House, Battersea Arts Centre, Hoxton Cinema, etc. Here the architects who included Richard Rogers Partnership, Burrow Foley Fisher, Allies Morrison, Tim Ronald, Norman Foster explained their interventions, not without criticism from the first-year students of the AA, to the students. Students then had to develop their own projects based upon what they had learnt on sight, sound, mobility, cognition that day. Several series of evening lectures were held, which were free and open to the public. They started off being under the title Access, Architecture and Architects, and later Inclusive Design. None of the presentations has ever been published. They were always well attended, but generally by people from outside the school. This may now change with the legislation relating to 2004 holding a threat to negligent architectural practices, encouraging an interest in a more rounded approach to design. I noticed that the lectures that are being held at the RIBA are much better attended now, and I think it's all to do with this problem that people want to know what's going to happen. The AA prospectus was talking about inclusive design from 1995 and mirrors the change of the British Institute for Design and Disability, BID, heaven forbid, which was founded in the AA in 1995, the United Kingdom Institute for Inclusive Design, UKID, the new kids on the block, and in 1998, once the membership was allowed to vote. There was even an access prize judged by graduate students and awarded by the chair to undergraduate students. The work was related also to other schools in Europe, North America and the developing world. Socially oriented courses, I think, may have been earlier, Greenwich and Dundee universities and later Leeds. I'm not quite sure when the Royal College started their work, but we'll be told. Access courses sprang up in Newcastle, Salford, Bristol, Belfast, Dublin, Singapore. Last year, Reading changed the name of its MA from non-handicapping environments to inclusive environments. And now, encouraged by former AA student Amanda Gibbard, the Pretoria School of Architecture is to introduce inclusive design. I have not covered North America, but all the developed world has something going on, all doing it from different angles, which is very encouraging. Still very little in architectural schools. In fact, little has changed since the research by Milner and Urquhart in Dundee about 15 years ago, when they said there was hardly any work going on this in the architectural schools. They're not even accessible, most of them. They developed the inclination to think quite early to total inclusion, not just of disabled people as a group, but the whole population. Issues of race and gender had been included from the start. We used to show a video on black people in the countryside, and I remember in the first week of the course, one of the students said, well, yes, they do look out of place, don't they? You know, and I had to point out that because of their long clothes, long dresses, and I said, well, Jane Austen wouldn't have looked, would she? No. But she soon got the idea. Also, the idea of getting away from the special needs label had been fundamental. It was People First's motto, label jars, not people. The undergraduate students had to take a project and modify their design so they could be used by anyone. Hence, inclusive design is born. Now the school has asked the subject to be approached again, and once again I've asked that an MA is introduced in dealing with inclusive design. I've been pushing for this since 1996, and at last with your help I hope we'll be getting somewhere. The term inclusive design is now being bandied about by many people. It has been described as designing for all disabled people, and I've even heard a past president of the RIBA 2 months ago saying inclusive design is designing for disabled people from the start of the project. These are wrong and dangerous definitions. Inclusive design is designing for all people from the start, young, middle-aged, old. More than this, it encompasses all design: planning, building, product design, communications design, graphics, and transport. To do this, there must also be an understanding of the economic and cultural necessity to do it. Whilst a course can be established which fits into the mechanisms for the MAs currently provided in the school, it means that it must, at a School of Architecture, include more than just debate and architectural propositions. It does mean that other professions will need to be there on such a course to instruct and be taught. This is very difficult for the profession to understand. It must practically relate to the users and be tested, and it must be broad in scope and be constantly developing. Part of that development, I hope, will be other institutions. Some of them have represented here. I see that Dublin and Salford, all people come from all over tonight, and I'm very pleased about that. And also, I hope, there will be developments with the undergraduate school. Thank you very much.
Hello everybody, my name is Roger Coleman. I'm Director of the Helen Hamlin Research Centre at the Royal College of Art, and Andrew asked me to come and tell you a bit about the work that we've been doing there over the past 9.5 years since I started. When I started at Royal College of Art, I had a brief which was to explore the implications for design of ageing population. After some discussion, we called the project Design Age, and over the course of it, developed the idea of design for our future selves, because the big challenge in a very dynamic and leading design institute like the Royal College is to find a way in which younger people could engage with older people and realise that it was important that they started to consider older people as part of the user group for everything that they design. The idea of design for our future selves was to sort of try and break down the segregation of the population into different groups, stop young students from seeing older people as from another planet. The sort of girls come from Venus, boys come from Mars, and older people come from somewhere out near the asteroid belt. But that actually older people were ourselves further on in the life course. That was the sort of idea that we developed. I didn't have my own students to start off with, so I had to use these sort of agit-prop tactics to try and engage the college with the ideas. A central idea really was that we actually design and construct the whole world around us, and the way that we do it impinges on people quite dramatically. We can disable just as effectively as we can enable by design. And these are, in the world of architecture, these sort of thoughts have been applied very well to access. In the past, Andrew has been one of the leading figures in this area, and we have other people in the room who have been driving this forward. But there are great other areas of the world where design excludes rather than includes people. And as we moved into the new century, I like the idea of talking about inclusive design because it's something that we can aspire to. We can try and make the world progressively more inclusive. And that means including, as Andrew said, everybody. When I started, one of my first jobs was to put together facts and figures. These are actually, this graph was put together by Dr. John Gill from the RNIB, and it's trying to estimate the number of disabled people in the whole of geographic Europe. Difficult task because you can't compare the figures and censuses aren't consistent and so on. But it's a rough estimate. We're looking at people on a basis of 800 million people in geographic Europe. Why I've shown this is because it reveals the very interesting fact that I was trying to get at, looking at population aging in relation to design. If you look at the top bar is the number of wheelchair users, about 4.5 million. The next bar down is people who cannot walk without some sort of an aid or assistance. That's 45 million, 10 times as many. And if you come down and you look again at the number of deaf people, profoundly deaf people, compared with the number of people who are hard of hearing, the difference is even greater. If you look at the number of people who are blind and have low vision and compare them to the number of people who use, say, prescription glasses as I do, then the difference is even bigger still. The vast majority of these people who fall into these really big number groups are older people, not younger people. And this again reinforces the fact that through the course of our lifetime, as our capabilities change, we are all going to be impacted on by things like graphic design, the design of buildings, also the way products function and the way you can hold and manipulate them. So this becomes an issue which really does genuinely affect all of us. And that was a very crucial point. When we look at older people, we can see the extent to which inconsiderate design, I've shown a few examples here, the London Transport Ticket Machine, the video machine, classic one, and labelling in supermarkets and so on. We show you just how, one of the first things we did actually was I took groups of students outside and we took photographs and we looked at older people and what was happening in their world. You can see just how disabling that sort of inconsiderate design is. Here's classic London bus, but the other shots are of Eurostar, on which we spent billions of pounds. When you go to Waterloo Station, there's a voice which says, will you please mind the gap? Because there's a gap everybody has to cart their cases over as they go off on holiday. When you get to Brussels, they have to unfold a set of steps from the train. We spent billions on this. We should have got the infrastructure right. This should never have happened. When I talked to some of the people involved in the design of the locomotives and carriages, they said it wasn't on a brief. There are really big issues here. We can do things better by simply applying some thought. We can look at and improve the way that we design things and make sure that they include older people. I focus specifically on older people at the RCA because that was my brief at the beginning, but also I felt that population ageing gave me a way to drive this right through to the mainstream of design. Here's figures I put to from UK censuses which show, if you look at the red bar and below, that gives you everybody in the population up to the age of 50. And you can see that over a period of 100 years, the number of people aged 50 or less has hardly changed. All the growth has been in the 50+ sector of the population. Every new consumer on the street in an expanding marketplace is over 50, not under 50. So there are huge economic reasons for paying attention to this as well, and huge economic disadvantages for people who get it wrong. The next step I took after having put together facts and figures which would start to mount an argument for inclusive design was to get students to work with older people. So through a relationship with University of the Third Age, older people, retired people started coming into college. Other colleges picked up the idea. Here's shots from Glasgow and the RCA. And this allowed us to put young students together with older people for them to work as focus groups, to try out and experiment with ideas and so on. What was great about it was not just the practical nature of it, but, and really surprised me, was the amount of enjoyment that everybody got from it. When we put the two groups of people together, it really worked. There was a lot of chemistry going on, and that made a difference and inspired some very interesting design work, which I'll show you in a minute. It also made it possible for us to work with designers. Here, these shots are just about the work that we did with designer David Coleman, who's in the top right-hand corner of the picture, on developing new seating for Leighton House Museum, the brief being that this should be seating where older people as well as younger people could pause and rest during their journey around the museum. This is what David designed finally. I won't go into all the details of it. There's lots of factors here which came out of the work. The final design was meant to fit in that very special building which had been the home of Lord Leighton, Victorian painter. But it also, what he learned, allowed David to develop a new product for his own company, Tranon Furniture, which could bridge between public and private places that was age-friendly but was also carer-friendly as well, and developed a new market area for his company. One of the things that I felt was terribly important was to have inspiring examples to show to people, and the way to encourage this was through a college-wide competition, getting our students to enter for a Designing for Our Future Selves competition. And I'll just show you one or two of the entries from that, the winning entries. This is a very simple addition to an ordinary plug to make it easier to pull out, extremely cheap, very practical. This is a printed sound reader. You can print sound in format rather like barcodes. So here's an opportunity to print things like gas bills and so on, and have a reader which can read the bill to you. You could also use it for children's books so that they could hear the big bad wolf and the sound he makes when he blows the house down. This was a lightweight chair for a gallery so that people could carry something around the gallery and pause and sit down when they wanted to stop and rest in front of a picture. And here is, this was a very specific product. This has gone, I've showed you this because it's actually gone into production, which is great. And this is for care homes and so on, and it's a transporter for people, which allows people who've got some upper body strength to lift themselves up into this. And when they're moved around, they have they're at eye level with the carer, so there's eye contact, personal contact with the carer. It takes the strain off the carer's backs. It's something which is liked by both the patients and the carers. That was all very successful, and recently we've expanded and got more money into the college, and we now have the Helen Hamlin Research Centre, which gives me my own students, and we've created an opportunity for some of our best students to do a further year after they've completed their MA as staff researchers at the RCA. And building on the Design for Our Future Selves concept, we've developed 4 social change themes that we're focusing on: ageing populations, changing patterns of living and working, transport and mobility, and care for our future selves. And we're looking at these from the point of view of inclusive design, and we're putting our post-MA students in partnership with companies, industrial companies, charities, and other organisations for a year of design research. Last year, Karen Adcock and Carl Turner worked with BAA on the 5th terminal, developing ideas for a sensory landscape which would facilitate instinctive wayfinding. They worked with visually impaired and older users on this, and out of that work they've now developed some very strong ideas for information delivery, and this year they're working on prototypes for a new information delivery system which will be incorporated into the 5th terminal. Here's Yuku Suramaru, who's now working with Ron Arad, and our partners there were the Design Council and Jeffrey Reed Associates, and she was working with low-paid home workers and trying to develop new tools and products which would make their practice easier. And you can see some of the designs that she'd developed. Very low cost, simple products which would make that sort of work easier. This is for people who work at the kitchen sink, particular user that she worked with, and she developed this rocking chair which will help them work at the sink. So this is looking at people who are normally excluded from design considerations and trying to develop new ideas around their needs. This is Lotte van Arnen, who was working on furniture for disabled teleworkers and working with 3 or 4 people who worked from home, and she developed this idea for a kidney-shaped desk and a carousel which would carry a wheelchair in it so that you can move around and access your work in some comfort. We've done more specific projects on developing, developing adaptations for things like wheelchairs. This is for, it's an adaptation for a wheelchair which helps people who've got upper body strength to stand up, and can also be used for rehabilitation treatment in hospitals. And finally, we worked with Levi Strauss Europe on developing a garment which provides impact protection. It's a combination of polymer which hardens very rapidly on impact with clothing, so that you can produce protective sportswear, but also you could develop joint-specific protection pads, so things like osteoporosis could be dealt with as well. And so this is a very nice idea here, because it's developing something which could work for people across the age range, from young, very active people to older people who were vulnerable to falls, and would have that nice little Levi's red tag on it, so it would be quite stylish, whatever age you were. I've got to the end of that now, but if anybody wants to find out more, that's our website address at the top of the slide there, www.hhrc.org. Okay, thank you.
It's the first time that's worked all afternoon, all evening, and I'm very pleased. So maybe I should take my leave now. My name's Ferguson. I'm Principal Product Design for Transport for London. And you're wondering, who on earth is Transport for London? Well, they're the people that are responsible for all the late arrivals and the late delivery of you home tonight. So if anyone's got any tomatoes or anything, I'm the person to throw them at. This evening, I just really wanted to talk about how inclusive design is interpreted and utilised at Transport for London. Essentially, these two words, inclusive equals included, included equals inclusive, is a very, very broad brush, but that's what we try to achieve. I've broken the presentation down into three parts. A very quick explanation of the change of organisation, which many of us, myself included sometimes, are quite unsure of which companies fit under Transport for London. Touch on the design policy and some of the issues contained within that and how that drives forward the idea of inclusive design, and show some new directions. Unfortunately, I won't be able to show the new touch screen ticket machine, which has superseded the 120 button machine that Roger showed earlier, which I'm not responsible for, but I'm responsible for the touchscreen one, so blame me. London Transport, as it used to be, and who I used to work for, was only responsible for the underground, the buses, in a roundabout way, the river services and tramlink in Croydon. The shape of the new company, we have Ken Livingston at the top, the GLA, Transport for London, as you can see, are now responsible for 8 different transport delivery companies. The Public Carriage Office responsible for taxis and licensing. The Street Management responsible for main arterial routes into town, such as Marylebone Road, Old Kent Road, etc. London Underground, which technically is out in the wilderness whilst it undergoes the PPP treatment or doesn't. London Trams, again in Croydon. London Buses, ECS, the Coach Station Victoria, River Services and Docklands Light Rail. So you can see our responsibility is magnified, well, it's at least doubled. So that offers the opportunity of affecting everything in London and creating a better seamless journey rather than having isolated companies doing perhaps the same thing with a slightly different interpretation and not quite getting it together. For instance, like the Eurostar terminal at Waterloo, I think we've managed to achieve on the Jubilee Line extension step-free access at all 11 new stations. So we managed to get that right. Now, as I said, I'm responsible for products and part of the design management team. All the products that I commission the design of must be, of course, fit for purpose and make best use of resources. We are all taxpayers, so I'm as much concerned about that as the next person. These are some of the elements that we look at and include in our design briefs and specifications for all projects. Interfaces. Transport for London is not a consumer company that provides an item which you can either choose to buy or choose to leave on the shelf. All of the products that we develop must fit into all of our environments. these, of course, range from listed buildings to contemporary. And at any time, of course, customers and staff must not be exposed to any risk. Ergonomic factors, the evaluation and use of anthropometric data makes it a perfect 5'8", right-handed, young male environment. So we use those figures, but at the same time, we must make sure they've got the correct size of products and arrange study groups with a diverse spectrum of our users, and don't rely just upon facts and figures, because they can be somewhat misleading and provide a somewhat measured solution. The visibility of our products, we're trying to enhance them in the environment so people can identify where they are, particularly if they're visually impaired, and either want to avoid the obstruction or actually make use of the item, whether it's a ticket machine or a health point, or of course the very edge of the platform on London Underground. And the colour contrast between a product and its surroundings again is very important, so it can be clearly identified rather than everything being a shade of grey, which contradicts the GLE, but there we go. All of the products should be clear and simple to use. You shouldn't require a PhD in mathematics to use. And the operation can be further enhanced by the use of pictograms and numbers, which is an inclusive issue because it makes the use of products more accessible to everybody, rather than being aimed at visitors to the country or people for whom English is not the first language. So the use of pictograms and or numbers helps to benefit everybody. Just the clarity, just trying to help steer people through the environment and through the experience. And further to that, confirmation by sight and sound. So you know that the machine is working. You're aware visually something's happening, something's processing, and hopefully that's confirmed by sound as well. And we have standardized colours, line colours obviously, and fonts or New Johnson, Bentley, etc. Mechanisms that don't, many of our mechanisms are actually quite Heath Robertson because they have been proven to work. New technology we use only when we're assured that it's actually going to provide benefit. So sometimes we rely on quite dated but reliable mechanisms because they have to work 364 days a year and 22 hours a day. Now, onto the third part of things, which gives some glimpses of the future, and, but starting off where we are now. This is a shot of a Central Line train, which is part of a train recycling programme, which included the Bakerloo line and the Victoria line. So they're not new trains, they were just simply recycled. But that's where we are now. Where we're going to for the Victoria line, this is a scale model of the concept known as space train, which, as I say, is going to be first introduced on the Victoria line, probably about 2010, 2012, and it increases the internal diameter of the carriage, so the kinetic envelope is reduced between train and tunnel. This we're able to do by not having 6 cars per train, but actually having 8. So they're smaller. They're able to facet round bends much more tightly, so we can increase the cross section of them. Longitudinally, there will be no longer any doors. There will be gaskets between each carriage, so that the tube train will literally be that one long tube. All of the doors and the public areas will be accessible, and the trains will be built to provide level access at all of the Victoria Line stations. Misha Black, when he designed the Victoria Line back in the early 60s, had the foresight to at least have consistency through all of the Victoria Line stations. So by implementing a new train, we can implement step-free access throughout the Victoria Line without having just one or two stations where it's either applicable, or one or two stations where there's a step or a drop down into the train. The much loved Route Master, not by me, which usually gets me tomatoes again because everybody loves it. And it's absolutely wonderful for somebody like myself, sort of young, fit and agile, that can jump on a running bus, shimmy up the stairs, grab a seat, jostle about and twist around to find my pass to show the conductor. But I think we've managed to make some progress with the new low floor double deckers. London Buses Services, I think, have 30% or 40% of the buses are low floor double deckers, which represents Europe-wide a massive, we're way out in front in providing low floor double deckers. The next stage is actually to, which is on the drawing board at the moment, is to do an amalgamated low floor double decker with features of the Route Master, which are proved to be effective in the very centre of town. Hopefully we'll bring, it's not going to be a bodge job of having an open back on a low floor bus, but some of the sketches are a bit like that. So that's something that we're looking to put forward to the business market, as we've done in the past, to encourage them to develop their own ideas, which they've then found that they can market elsewhere in the country and abroad. The river services, this festival pier, which was probably built in 1950 odd for the Festival of Britain in 51. The river has been tired, underused and perhaps misunderstood for public use. And what we've done over the last 2 years is commissioned, I think it's 9 new piers, which are completely accessible via ramps, both from the street level and from the pier onto the boat itself. The boats themselves haven't quite got there yet because we're still dependent upon private operators for those services. But hopefully now the piers and the use of the river is being clarified and made more attractive through the use of new accessible buildings. Taxis, public carriage office. The highest price you pay per mile with the lowest comfort and the lowest convenience, as you see here at Charing Cross. You're going to be jumping into a black cab, paying at least £5 to go a couple of 100 yards, and you're being asked to stand beside a wonky sign that says taxi please use the other side or something. That's not very sort of encouraging or informative. All of London taxis, of course, now legally have to carry a set of ramps, and of course, what's his name? The pentagram, Kenneth Grange, who designed the new taxi cab, made them completely accessible. Perhaps in the future for taxis, we'll have something more akin to a bus stop environment, which may include an information point which links you directly to a cab, so you can in effect electronically hail a cab from the taxi shelter. So it's providing a better service for those people who choose to travel by taxi. Under the public carriage office, we'll also be creating a new licensed minicab service, because at the moment people just use them as a last gasp solution. Most of them are unlicensed, and people don't have a great deal of confidence in actually in the service. However, in the future, the minicabs, when they're licensed, will perhaps have more akin to a retail environment, such as the Eat chain here, which provides clarity and confidence in the offer of minicabs. Then I think finally the roads themselves, we're all affected by congestion, pollution, and the journey time. And people, my colleagues in street management, are looking at providing, through the road charging scheme, enhancements of the road network. And of course, we're also looking at providing more tram routes through London. Of course, currently there's only one down at Croydon, but we're looking at creating intermediate modes into town along the Uxbridge Road and up the Old Kent Road, opening up areas of London which traditionally have only been accessed by car. And finally, looking at the lorries and distribution, which don't particularly suit the narrow streets due to the sizes, making more use of the river through having satellite depots for supermarkets and taking the weight of the traffic off of the roads. So that's explaining where Transport for London is coming from and some of the issues that we believe are important to inclusive design. So, thank you.
I think now really is kind of time to kind of throw the discussion open. Maybe it may be that some people will want to kind of ask questions about current work that we've seen being presented. But I think in a way there's also like the agenda of the evening in terms of our wish that you can kind of comment and contribute to the way in which we're planning the MA in inclusive design. And I suppose in some sense it's worth perhaps drawing a distinction between kind of different kinds of kind of elements or arguments which would go to make up that course. I think in the contributions and in what Andrew said already, first of all, there's a strong wish to produce a kind of definition, or rather a redefinition, of what the whole kind of business is about. That is to say that in order that the term inclusive design be not just a sort of rhetorical device, it's clearly founded upon what you might call like a political concept of what is at stake, that in a democratic society, a kind of freedom of movement and of use is an imperative kind of within the field of design. And that requires that any such course is going to sort of reflect that in its ideology, perhaps also in its critique of previous approaches, which were sort of perhaps overly sort of physical and, in their approach to design issues, and perhaps kind of overly philanthropic in a rather kind of timid openness to these questions. So at one level, we're asking kind of how might within an MA course that renovated political ideology of what we're doing be reflected. And then, as it were, I suppose, the next level within the MA is that students would need to kind of know, both at a design, at a legal, at a social level, kind of what there is. And thirdly, obviously, there's the commitment to the student being able to make some kind of design contribution or kind of proposition. So maybe we could sort of kind of start by inviting kind of comments in a way at the first issue, which is that issue of really the definition and the politics of what's at stake. Mary.
I'd like to ask who you see as the students for this MA course. Is it going to be mostly architecture students who have reached the MA level, or will it include people from other aspects of the community who would be maybe in jobs already, as in the case of the course in 1993, which I gate crashed, right? And in the first 4 weeks I learned more about what was going on in a field I should have known about, because I'd been disabled by then about 40 years. I was so astonished by what came, and it was partly to do with the people who were there, the students. So I would like to know how you see that developing.
Perhaps Andrew would like to reply.
I think that was one of the assets of the old course, but also one of the problems was we weren't encouraging, it wasn't attractive enough for architects, and I do think we do need to make the new course, as it's coming from School of Architecture, very much relate to architecture, but I do think we do need the input from all kinds of people to give that extra insight, which architects with their very limited perceptions actually, although they think they're the Renaissance princesses, whatever, we do need other input, and that is the problem with architecture. It's too grey.
I mean, I think it's a very interesting kind of question, and when we've been discussing it, without losing kind of the people who had been coming, or the kind of person who had been coming, I think there was a feeling, first of all, not only that we ought to be bringing architects, but we ought in a sense to be confronting architectural practices with a certain kind of responsibility to make that possible for people who work within their offices. Seems to me absolutely kind of no reason why a reasonably large practice shouldn't in effect second someone from the practice to come to such a course. And I think once you've said that, it also places on certain types of organisations, perhaps like large kind of arts organisations, the possibility of kind of seconding people kind of from them. I mean, there is here this evening Kate Jones from the Barbican, who used to work here and who I believe has been seconded to the course at Reading. Maybe you could kind of say something about that.
I work very much with the day-to-day management at the centre, and my background is not architectural, but I think the Barbican now realises that it needs to have someone within the building who has some kind of training and understanding of the issues of inclusive design, especially as the Barbican is going through multi-million-pound redevelopments, or certainly on paper anyway. And yes, I think they were very willing to fund me through the course, and at the time that I was looking at the courses, Reading seemed to be the most suitable for me. Does deal with management specifically, and they're very happy for me to do that. And I do think also, speaking to other arts venues, I do find more and more people are aware of these master's degrees. This is an MSc at Reading, and are very, very keen that their employees should take part. The Barbican seems to have been rather embarrassed about its lack of access provision and its lack of engagement with the issues that it so sorely needs to face. And I hope this is the start. It's actually going at the same time as setting up an access group at the centre finally. So everything is kind of gearing up, I hope, for them to really grasp the nettle. That's about it.
I do think, just to reiterate what other people are saying, I think it's really important to have a mix of people on the courses. Speaking as an occupational therapist who attended the course here, I found it very useful with different backgrounds, and I think it's really important to concentrate. So much of inclusive design is about how the idea is approached and how the building is managed, or how transport is managed. Those kind of issues are very, I think for architects it sometimes becomes totally about the fabric of the building, and actually the attitudes and the management can be much more effective in the access than having a ramp at the start of the front of the building.
If I can answer that question, I've been thinking about words, this sort of stuff for a long time, and when I first came into it, everyone was talking about barrier-free, which I thought was a very political phrase, and to some extent, I've always thought that architecture was the art of barriers. I mean, we need barriers in our society. There are times when you don't want to be accessible, and you don't want to fall on railway tracks, you don't want all these other things, and so that I thought it was a completely wrong expression, which I think has come over from America and then been misinterpreted. There's also
used in Scotland.
Well, it's still used in all kinds of places, but it's growing out of use, just as invalid, invalid. It's gone, and we don't talk about the blacks, we talk about black people and all these other things. We still talk about the disabled, unfortunately, because we aren't human yet, but there we are. There is also universal design. Well, universal design is fine if you want that. It's in the United States, sort of with scope, democracy, whatever. And if you want a sock which fits everybody, that's fine. And I think you need to be a bit more subtle than that, or a shoe that fits somebody, everybody. Universal design. You have to think of all the other things that are required to make things work for people, because we're all different. There's a diversity of stuff. And I think Europe is more sophisticated in that sense in terms of language. On the European mainland, it's becoming called design for all, which is fine, but it's 3 words. And inclusive design is saying what it means. It's including. And if you want an inclusive society, then you have to promote inclusive design. It's terribly simple. And it allows for adaptive bits and pieces. It allows you to have a pop-up bath or pop-up television or a bath lift or whatever. It's treating everyone as having requirements, choice, as well as some general socio-political integration. Is that of any use?
Well, yes, Andrew, could you address that thing? Will it be the term inclusive become one of those terms that won't last the course?
I'm no seer, but I'm sure it's lasted. It's a proper use of English, and that's what makes me happy. And I don't think it matters if there are different ways of talking about things in different parts of the world, which are meaning virtually the same thing. It's cultural diversity too.
Can we take a point here?
Yeah. Or maybe I can use this one. Can I? that I really don't think the terms matter. What matters is whether people can gather together around them and whether they can flesh out a course of action which will promote change. And universal design works in the States. It's been taken up in Japan. That's great. My own feeling is that in a Europe which is struggling to be inclusive and which has completely different cultural background to the States, inclusive makes sense because it aligns itself with other political aspirations and so on. So it's the sort of thing I feel that the companies can understand and therefore buy into, and it also has a sort of progressive sense to it that you can become more inclusive rather than an adversarial suggestion which hangs around universal design, but then America is quite adversarial in its character. So I'm sort of happy with this, and I think if the proof of the pudding is, can people gather around it and effect change? And if change happens, then if the word gets abandoned 10 years down the line, who cares?
I mean, I think that whether or not inclusive design is the right term, I don't know. But I think universal design is the wrong one. I mean, because in a way it suggests that there is a kind of abstract, almost scientific kind of answer to design questions, which is kind of indifferent to cultural differences. Now, precisely as it were, the important point about inclusion is finding the way within any one culture in which inclusion can be maximized. And that has to actually take account as one of its elements of the culture within which it operates. So I think one would be kind of giving a hostage to fortune if one thought that there are design principles universally applicable and indifferent to the culture and the politics of the particular society within which they're applied. I mean, I'd be happy to see a term like democratic kind of design. I think inclusive is in that sense fine. I can't see it falling out of favour, except in an England where the very idea of inclusion falls out of favour every time the Tories come to power. Or Labour. Possibly the only objection to it is, has it already been used by Blair?
Yes, it's still.
I think the desirable thing is that it does fall out of favour when we just talk about design, and it's ultimately an automatic component of good design.
Eventual aim, I agree.
Could I make a few observations going back to the initial comment about who's the course for? My understanding, albeit limited, of the Architecture Association, that it has thrived on having teachers maybe passing through from all sorts of disciplines, and in fact it's reflected in the bookshop downstairs, what books are there. And has been one of the most interesting elements of the AA, and has contributed to what the AA has produced in terms of architects. Secondly, outside the doors of any school of architecture, architecture is built by teams, not individuals or prima donnas. So the fact that you assemble as a student body people from different disciplines working on the same sort of problems is actually helping the industry out there and helping to fit students to that. So that multidisciplinary course and its activities may be very important for the school as a whole. I then want to make a kind of, I suppose, an example of the potency of interdisciplinary approach to this subject by making an observation which might help to, I suppose, inspire the profession, intrigue the profession, engage with it. And it's to do with painters, and I'm sure the AA is not hostile to painters. And painters, for centuries, have been ingenious in dealing with the deficits of their medium, which is this flat thing, a wall, a canvas, a piece of paper, and using paints which have very limited luminosity and brightness. And they have invented all sorts of things with colour contrast, tonal contrast, etc., to overcome the deficits of their media, to make it more volumetric, brighter, more sparkling. But if you look at the techniques they have used, they actually correspond quite well with the requirements for the visual environment for persons with visual deficits. So there you have the possibility of actually, you're not dealing with the deficits of the medium, you're dealing with the deficits of society in general, and the mechanisms are the same. And there is this kind of immediate crossover. And that's just as an example. And the third thing I want to say why I have this instrument in my hand is that if you look at industry, and particularly in societies where there is increasing labour shortage, or the employee is an important person to keep because they have the knowledge, that the best practice in industry is to provide the individual with a work environment which fits them, no matter who they are, what they are, or maybe it's a whim. They're doing everything they can to keep that person, to make them comfortable, to make sure their work station fits their body and their expertise. So it's already out there happening. So, you know, it has to be engaged with, and engaged with to include everyone, including the forgotten.
As a resident of New York City, and looking at the way this process has taken place over there, there is one thing that I was wondering, and that is whether you were proposing to include a cultural element in this course. The socio-political element seems to be taken care of once things go into law. All New York developers and constructors essentially are frightened of being litigated against, and they need their certificates of occupancy. Essentially, this is built into the process, and it would be very, very difficult even for the most antagonistic or reactionary group of people to undo it. One of the point I'm really coming to is that we live in a society that is obsessed with speed and obsessed with doing things faster and faster. And that consciousness seems to me that perhaps the most aggressive problem faced when you're trying to deal with inclusion. Because an awful lot of the things that you are wanting to build into the design, which are needed to include people who have difficulties of whatever kind, slow the process down. And it seems that that is a fundamental tension in addition to the social political ones, which is often just lack of awareness. So I was just wondering about that.
I think Mark should, but can I just say that when I was in Boston, I was amazed how patient the people of Boston were with wheelchair users using those dreadful buses with steps that become ramps and go up and down, lifts and go up and down. It just wouldn't work in London. You've got to get off and on quickly. Otherwise you'll have a riot. But I mean, that's just an aside, really.
I mean, I think the question that you raised about kind of speed, one could always kind of take it in two different ways. One is obviously the kind of very difficult question speed, but it could be other criteria of performance, which in some sense make the principle of inclusion kind of more and more difficult to kind of engage with. And I think that has to be, first of all, kind of analysed partly kind of at the level of why it is indeed that those kind of criteria of performance kind of have to be met. After all, you know, if you look at most of the sort of so-called questions about speed, I'm not sure that we're really that interested in going faster. We're more interested in not going slower and slower. And you might almost say at that point it's a slowness that doesn't help the principle of inclusion either. What I'm trying to say is that I think your point is extremely interesting. And I think it's the kind of conceptual issue which needs to be kind of patiently looked into and tested by such a course. I mean, that would really, you know, there do seem to be a number of very fundamental, you know, you could almost call them kind of theoretical issues, but they're not just theoretical, they're, you know, sublimely and socially important, in which, in the past, perhaps, you know, some of the courses concerned with access have thought that's a kind of intellectualization of issues that draw us away from immediate practicality. Whereas I think one thing that the AA kind of does stand for is the recognition that in dealing with those kinds of theoretical issues, you may well be kind of penetrating to the heart of a practical issue in a way that no one's quite seen.
Yeah.
So, you know, I mean, if I could use your intervention, you know, sort of possibly to kind of open up the question of what would be really distinctive about such a course at the AA, is that it would neither be afraid of nor ashamed in kind of saying, yes, we are going to patiently work through this question. We don't know quite, as with any theoretical question, what the outcome is. You know, the thought has to be kind of followed as to where it'll fall. But I think, you know, that is exactly the level of and the type of question. Now, and I would also want to say this, kind of working within the kind of graduate school as a whole, I would want to make this point, that when the course becomes an MA, it should be generating courses within it which are of interest to other graduate students, kind of, you know, initially at the AA, who perhaps might be from the Housing and Urban program, or from the Energy and Conservation program, or from the History and Theory, or from the kind of graduate design. You know, that's I think it has to be kind of integrated fully in an intellectual culture, a graduate culture, which is not allowed to which is not afraid to kind of theorize and problematize a whole kind of range of issues. And it would be our belief, I think, that not sort of standing out as an isolated course, but actually being fully integrated in the whole conspectus of graduate concerns, is one which ultimately bears advantageously on the practical questions. I'm sorry, that's a sort of roundabout way of kind of answering.
Yeah, I think that kind of answers the question which I was going to ask, which is, if this is so inclusive, why is there a need for a separate course? Surely it should be integrated into all AA courses. Unless to understand the issues of that. But I think one of the important things that would be good within a course is specific research
type of thing, the point about integration. I mean, first of all, the existence of such a course is itself no obstacle to the further integration of those questions, you know, within not just graduate education, but the full undergraduate kind of, you know, syllabus here. You know, I don't think that one can kind of put them in any sort of kind of conflict there. It seems to me the more an issue is raised in an institution, the more it's taken up. It's very, you know, ultimately it's very simple. Secondly, I don't think there's any kind of harm in a degree of specialization of questions, because I think that's the way kind of debate kind of happens. You know, I'm sure, for example, if a student goes to energy and conservation, and the other student goes to graduate design, they'll probably sort of start off with quite conflicting views about the relative claims of design versus the environment. But it's precisely the possibility of holding them together in, you know, one large graduate program that an argument can take place. Sorry, I think someone was...
I just wanted to, on the same theme, just say that the Access Association wrote around to all schools of architecture in the country to find out sort of what they were doing in their undergraduate courses, and the reply was definitely silence. And I know that the AA were the first to start an access course, that there's tremendous, there's tremendous experience there. And I was wondering whether, from setting up another course also, the AA could be a proselytizer and perhaps sort of find some way of actually exporting that into sort of modules for architectural colleges and other construction courses around the country. Because I think that is really where we're lacking. There are now actually several courses, specialised courses, as postgraduate courses in environmental access, but it's not getting in at the ground floor, if you like, in the undergraduate courses still at all.
I would very much like to endorse that point. In fact, I think one of the things I'm particularly interested in is the idea of perhaps bringing maybe some of the other courses, initiatives together with a view to perhaps developing remote modules, bringing, you know, actually trying to sort of interchange as a way of trying to develop this greater multidisciplinary aspect that you were mentioning before, because I think, as you probably know, Andrew, I'm interested very much at the sort of city and sort of street, the sort of that sort of spatial level, as opposed to the building, which I think is a very much neglected area. But I could see that, say, for example, you had a specialism in one part of the country where somebody had a particular benefit there. I mean, is there a way of integrating all this together so that there's a more cooperative thing? And in a sense, the AA could lead other courses to say, look, this is really important and you should be doing this too. We've made a small start ourselves in our own undergraduate program by having a requirement that all projects, for example, have to be judged by a kind of people specification. But I think we're probably one of the few courses that has done anything at all on really trying to get it integrated into everything that students are doing at the undergraduate level, certainly. And I just wonder what the scope is. You know, is the scope for trying to build on some of the things that are already happening elsewhere, maybe integrating them in to the AA course, and in that way encouraging the other places that perhaps have got either not enough has happened, or maybe somebody like myself is working very much in isolation within a particular community, trying to sort of push things on. You know, I very much worry I might end up on one of your London buses, because if I do, then I fear that a lot of the work I've done might get lost.
Get it all on the internet.
Obviously, that's the sort of thing I would welcome, but I think it's there there isn't anyone doing it. The RIBA doesn't seem to be doing it. There seems to be no push coming, no funding, no initiatives to do it. I don't know what the chair's position would be on it. Who was here is not here now. I just don't know. I mean, obviously, it would be. I tried to set up a conference on education about 10 years ago. I got about 20 disability organisations to say they'd come, and I think 2 schools of architecture, and it was decided not to do it because there was not enough conversation. And that's the problem. Most architectural schools are not accessible yet. This school has now got a proposition to have a lift in it. And I'm sure it's going to happen. It will have to happen here before a course can be run here. But there's a huge amount that could be done by the people that should be doing it, which is well, the RIBA, when they're monitoring the schools at their quinquennial inspections, should be finding out about the access, and that's not on the agenda. I don't know. Anyone else have anything to say?
I was very pleased to be at the meeting that Andrew had nearly 10 years ago, I think now, when we first discussed setting up the course at the AA. And I was one of the first year students on the Environmental Access course in 1993. Very exciting time, very exciting course. I learnt an awful lot. And I'm rather disappointed that the course only ran for 2 or 3 years after that, and it's now 2001. And we're still here talking about shall we or shan't we put on an MA course. The AA was at the forefront of putting on courses for students on environmental access, and now I think they're falling behind. And it's also really disappointing that I've come here, I haven't been to the AA for a while, and that blooming ramp is still outside the front door. When on earth is this? Yes, when on earth is this building going to be made accessible? I think we should just get on with it. Set the course up now, do it. There are lots of people out there who are very interested. There's more. The world is completely different to how it was 10 years ago because of the Disability Discrimination Act, and things have moved on politically and socially. There's a lot more awareness from architects and developers and everybody about access issues. And I would like the AA to run the course. I'd like you to run the undergraduate course. I'd like you to mainstream access with all your undergraduate architects as well as your postgrad courses as well, and just do it.
Well, we're in the same way. We're in this same. Sorry, can I just say this? We're in the same position now we were really in 1992, because then we had, although society's moved on, comparatively it's the same position, because then we had got a lavatory put in, we got level access and blah, 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 and then the course could be set up. Now we're doing the same with a lift, and a more sophisticated course could be set up. I did ask that the course could be run, and it could be run at the building centre until the school was made accessible, which would get an incentive for funding and to get the school lift in, which is going to cost several £1 million now, not the 80,000 that it would have been 10 years ago.
Sorry. Mark, I just wanted to add to your interesting question about what would be specific to the course at the AA.
Thanks. It seems to me that when one experiences the world from a particular position of disability, one experiences it in a very different way. In fact, very often in such a different way that it can be a rather interesting and rewarding way, which people who are undisabled can learn something from. And that, of course, brings one back to what we were talking about before about interdisciplinary or multicultural approaches, that perhaps that could be something very specific to a school of architecture. I mean, for example, Le Corbusier has said that stairs separate and ramps connect. So there are obviously very specific points, very specific architectural points that one could think about. I suppose I'd just like to add that one of the really delightful things about the designed objects from the RCA is that not only are they very functional, but they're also actually very beautiful. And it seems to me that that is why School of Architecture would be an excellent place to hold such a course in.
That's right. I mean, could I reply to that by just kind of mentioning one aspect, which I think such an MA really ought would certainly differentiate it from the way the issue is being taken in the past. It seems to me that you know, up to relatively recently, at the level of the human being and at the level of experience, disability, the very category of disability is really one which relies on the idea of deficit. That there is some kind of deficit from normality which needs, through prosthesis or some other kind of device, to be in effect compensated. Now, it seems to me that in the last 25 years, not within this field at all, but often, for example, in philosophy or in the history of medicine, there has been a vast amount of scholarly work completely reopening up the whole history of the nature and the history of the perception of, say, blindness or deafness. There is an enormous kind of literature which gives rise to thinking about these things not in terms of like some simple deficit, but what you might call a kind of differential phenomenology, a kind of a form of experience of the world which actually needs to be charted and described in its difference, because its difference really is different rather than just minus something from normality.
Well, this is something we've always maintained on the course, which is why we had those endless things, various buildings, Arts Council supported buildings, explaining different perceptions of the senses, the cognition, and all these other things, which would then enrich the students. Thank you very much. Students' own work right from the first year. So I do echo that. It's just that one of the problems I see it is that the mainstream school and the graduate school has not connected with what was going on in its own institution. In our lectures that were held year after year, none of which have been published, all of which the material I have, but they refused to be published, it's not come through to the mainstream school. It goes out to the world and not to the mainstream school, which is really irritating. So I do echo I do support you totally in that. There's wonderful, wonderful things that happens to you if you become a disabled person. You learn about all kinds of things which are totally unknown by architects or designers or politicians or anything. It's a magical world in many ways. We talk about we don't talk about undisabled, able-bodied people. We talk about non-disabled people. They're missing out.
Can I?
Sorry. Yes.
Can I add something? Oh yes, sorry. So I do. Two things. One point for you, Andrew, which is that the biggest problem I have had in what I've been doing at the RCA has been the RCA. Yeah. Without a doubt, it's the internal problems, and we've had respect outside for what we've been doing, far less respect inside because it's that particular sort of institution. And the issue is, but the exciting thing about that is the issue is about cultural change, and cultural change isn't something which happens overnight, and this isn't. So my sort of feeling about it is you don't want a course which is about teaching architects to do access properly. It's not a problem that we'll fix. It's actually about cultural change and about understanding some of these other issues we've been talking about. What I've been trying to do at the RCA is say, look, if designers work with people who are different to them, they get an insight which can be inspirational, and the results can be innovatory. And if what your course can do is develop a sort of in-depth understanding of the sorts of issues that it wants to address and act as a focus for cultural change and develop this idea that there is a new field in which we can innovate to create a world which hasn't existed before. That's where I think it's suddenly exciting rather than... Sorry.
Do you need a course or a campaign? Or do you need a campaigning course? Do you need to run the...
Well, a course...
it seems to me that day one, week one, first year, it should be the first lecture, shouldn't it? Design, planning, architecture should include everyone, and that cultural message has got to go across to
first course was going, there were students from other departments in the AA who were involved in presenting their designs. Remember? Yeah. And I will never forget one young lad who did present his design. He was a first year student, and he became really excited about the business of thinking this way right from the moment he entered these portals. And it was much supported by us, but I never heard anybody else say such a thing. And I also wanted to ask Roger, what about the architecture department at the Royal College? Are they interested at all?
Yes, took a long time. now they're very interested, yes. But it's what I don't work with the architecture department on issues of access at all. It's different ways of thinking about how buildings are used and who can use them and that sort of thing. So we pitched it at a different sort of intellectual level, and I think that that's very important. Actually, it has to be intellectually challenging as well as practically challenging. But I just wanted to come back to I agree with the business about the course needs to be a campaign as well, because that's the way I've always tried to do it. You run a campaign and you try and do the other stuff as well. But what is interesting, and I think you need to focus on, is where the students, their destination, where they end up. I find it hugely gratifying now to meet people who I've worked with at the RCA and are now working in very well-known design companies and are carrying on ideas about this approach to design, and they're becoming embedded in those companies. That is hugely heartening and gratifying. I think that there's a route through a course at the AA for people who are going to be influential, not just in managing buildings, but in other areas of society who can help carry the ideas forward if they've got a thorough grounding in them. And I think you need to think, how do we get 5 years, 10 years down the line a range of graduates who are out there and making a difference, and the world will never be the same because of it, you know.
Yes, we do have a student architect who's doing it in Nigeria, and now we do have Amanda Gibbard, who's going all around South Africa talking to architects and schools, and they would love to liaise with the AA.
Andrew, could I just say a word, looking at it from the other side of the fence, you know, somebody who's been through the RCA and this, that and other thing, that inclusive design actually makes business sense. Because particularly when Transport for London, public funded body responsible for paying for spending taxpayers' money, has to validate each and every decision financially. Along the way, we get to make some quite nice, quite beautiful products sometimes, but every decision must be validated objectively. And I think some inclusion of business methodology into the course would be beneficial, because it makes sense to the bean counters. So when the graduates come out of the course and they start waxing lyrically about inclusiveness, they're not shouted down because, it doesn't do this, it doesn't do that. They can talk the same language and prove that spending a bit of more money, more time in advance can actually provide a more beneficial end product, not just to the end users, but also a product which is beneficial to the bottom line as well, the financial bottom line.
Yes, can I just reply to that? I totally agree with that. It was the Roundtree Foundation that proved that extending Part M to include housing would have a financially beneficial effect, which is why it's now happened. Roger mentioned earlier about thinking about the kind of people that you want to turn out, and I think really the product you want is somebody who's completely confident in what they're doing. So the story I hear over and over again, that why a design has been created in such a way that it's produced in an accessible space or product or whatever, is because it's what the client wanted. And I think what we want are designers that have the confidence and the ammunition, if you like, to argue their position with clients, so that clients are left in no uncertain terms as to the theory behind the inclusive approach.
I think we should be thinking to kind of wind up, because we'd like to invite everyone to drinks in the South jury room. So maybe if we could sort of have one round of last comments, and then I'll ask kind of Andrew.
Just very quickly, I agree with Roger about the course, the MA course being about cultural change. I mean, I think that's terribly important, and I think that helped me in 1993 with the course. But I'm afraid I also think that architects need to be taught about access. The architects I come across still in my work still don't really understand about access, even for the disabled access, let alone inclusive access.
Hello. Oh, yeah. Somebody who used to use London Underground quite a lot, but now I've got an employer that very kindly pays for my taxis everywhere. I can only say that, just to echo what Julie says,